Paul Sommer is going to present the Garth Boomer address, and I've known Paul for many years now. It's been a great pleasure. I can remember when he joined SAETA Council, and then became president of SAETA, and then became president of AATE. And you know, we were thinking we're on to a winner here, and then what does he do? Up and go to Japan. It's like, Paul. But he's spent an extraordinary time in Japan continuing to do what he loves best, which is teach and think critically about the things he teaches. And he's taken great joy in working for many years now on a PhD in film, and it seemed highly appropriate to get him back here to Adelaide to give our Garth Boomer address. And I think we're going to show you a little film that Guy Bailey-Jones made, was it 10 years ago, Guy? 8 years ago? Yes, so it's a cycle of 8. So 8 years ago, when we were hosting this conference, Guy made this little film about Garth Boomer, because we're conscious that many of our audience are beginning to probably not know who the heck this guy was. So it's time you found out. So we'll show that video, and then after that I'm going to ask Paul to come up. Thank you.
It's been 43 years since I watched Garth Boomer beat a friend of mine 9-love in the first round of the state underage tennis championships at Memorial Drive in Adelaide. "Who's that?" I asked when the match was finished. "Garth Boomer," my friend answered. "Last year's champion, he's good." "Bloody hell," I said. "With a name like that, he has to be good." Garth Boomer wasn't just good, he was bloody good. And the interesting thing was that he knew it. At school and university, it was a surprise to me and others that such a super confident, vocal and self-opinionated person should be so popular amongst his peers, but he was. Apart from being an outstanding student, actor, speaker and sportsman, Garth, or Arch as we used to call him because of his initials RG, was a fun-loving and natural leader who, right from the very first moment we met him, had been unravelling the world and sharing his views with us and anyone else who would listen. As he grew older and more influential, the only things that changed were that his circle of friends widened, his audiences grew larger, and his opinions and ideas increased in intensity and significance. And even though he died in 1993, his ideas, concerns and ways of putting theory into practice are still very much with us today. Ideas and concerns like the primacy of talk, story, the imagination and action or doing in harnessing the force and power of television in our children's lives. The importance of talk and writing to learning and thought, and as a means of students and conference delegates reading the world. The importance of play as a way of learning.
Play really is about encouraging people to be enterprising, to show initiative, to have a go. And these are some of the things, unfortunately, that some formal schooling can sometimes knock out of kids.
The need for rigour in both methodology and content, and a widening of the concept of literary text to include oral literature, television and multimedia. The empowerment of both teachers and students in negotiating the curriculum. A readiness to embrace all literatures and texts and make connections that are gender and indeed culturally aware. And most of all, the need to know how and when a student understands and knows. Garth absorbed literature through his pores, and when he knew that he was dying, he asked me to read an excerpt from Tennyson's Ulysses at his funeral. The piece was totally appropriate because it showed that he understood the importance and worth of what he'd spent his whole life doing. Like Ulysses, he'd drunk life to the lees, become a name, been honoured and drunk the delight of battle with his peers. But like Ulysses, he wanted it known that he owed all of his triumphs to the people he'd met on his journey. The final words of the poem were a way of his reminding us of his role and wishing us all well for the future. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. 3 years earlier, when Garth sang Heartbreak Hotel at my 50th birthday, he did what he always did at conferences and in speeches. He rewrote the words to fit.
For Mr. Garth Boomer, dedicated to the place in which he works. And this song is, ladies and gentlemen, Heartbreak Hotel.
Okay, thank you very much, and it's lovely to be back at Adelaide. And it's also that there's a personal connection with Garth Boomer for me. Garth Boomer gave me my first job in teaching, literally. We sat across a small desk in a cramped space. This was well before Flinders Street, and he asked me why I wanted to teach. Now, I don't remember the details, but I remember the conversation really well. He was leaning back in the chair and leaning on the desk, and it was a long and free-flowing chat. But he gave me the impression that he wanted to know what I thought. And by the questions and by his attention, I had the feeling of what he was looking for, and it was a direction I wanted to go in. Anyway, long story short, I got the job. The very first classroom I stepped into was Lynn Wilkinson's, team teaching drama. And though I didn't understand it then, I was still under a gravitational force of Boomer. Lynn worked closely with him, and in an article in English in Australia, she described his effect on her in terms of passion, politics, and pedagogy. And these were not three different things. A world was being woven, profoundly shaped by people who'd worked with Boomer or been influenced by him. Others were in sync, especially the teachers' unions, which became the National Schools Network and middle schooling movements, under the banner of Ted Sizer's bold and loud assertion, "I cannot teach a child I do not know well." Questions about how we establish relationships with students and what we do with them, and about social justice and passion were common threads. For me, and for us here today, with the passing of a few decades, Boomer has become code for all that, a shorthand, a sign. There are many Boomers, but the one that interests me today is the one who spoke directly to the classroom teacher. And I know I'll romanticise him, but that's okay. I think we can do with a bit of that. And I'm not after a big picture of Boomer. What I'm looking for is rabbit holes into which we can escape and find another universe. There's no Boomer method. He was suspicious of gurus and what he termed the capitalisation of adoration. There is, however, an orientation, an intention, a restlessness, which is attractive. And through Boomer still exists as a spectre. I continue still to ask myself if what I'm offering my students is low-level crap, and it's his voice that's asking the question. Today I want to consider Boomer in relation to text, film in particular, or more accurately, I want to consider text in relation to him. In a special edition of English in Australia on the 20th anniversary of Boomer's death, Wayne Sawyer observed that of Boomer's triumvirate of language, literacy and literature, it's the latter that Boomer often seemed to say least. Sawyer takes us through a convincing argument that Boomer engaged with emerging definitions of literature. He seemed in no rush to close off a discussion. I am, by the way, regarding film as literature, and I don't think this is contentious, unless you see the whole field as contentious, as Bill Green was discussing yesterday. And there is a brief mention of film in a list of what Boomer counts as literature. I'm not arguing for it, I'm just asserting it at this point. What we do with the text when we bring it into the classroom is to impose limits on it. Or to put it more positively, following Ian Reid, we frame. How and why we do this is interesting, and it's also very well covered. My argument today is that with film, we limit too much, and too willingly, and to the detriment of film as a field. We do this by focusing too much on film as a visual text, and I'll get to that soon. Sawyer mentions an article in which Boomer did discuss the process of literature directly, and it was largely through a diagram that was the focus of an article published in Metaphor in 1974 and reprinted in English in Australia. It's Boomer's idea of literature as triangles, as eternal triangles. It starts to look a bit like a board game for English teachers, but if we stick with it for a moment, we can find some interesting things here. One of my first questions is, where's the teacher's self? We've got a writer's self, and we've got a reader's self. I suspect I already know the answer, and it probably goes along the lines of, well, really, who cares? Sawyer elsewhere argues that Boomer was saying that the job of a teacher is to stimulate a conversation between a reader and a writer. So with that kind of functional role in mind, it may explain why we have no intangible life. But there are interesting connections here. Why is there no connection between the reader's self and the reader's world? To put it in would create a tautology, the reader's world, the reader's self, the reader, while no such tautology exists for the writer. And this is the stuff of literary biography. So you can see that it's constructed with some care. Some triangles invite a collaborative mode, putting teacher in the triangle, and this might be a reader's cycle or a reader's club approach to literature. Other triangles don't involve the teacher at all, and this is a reminder that what we're doing in the classroom is part of a whole. There are other things going on in relation to texts. And there's one triangle that moves through another point, from the reader's self through the reader to other readers, creating a connection between the reader's self and the work. But what is this? It's a mapping of relationships in terms of classroom and text. If we make each of these points problematic, as we would want to as good post-structuralists, it would still remain an interesting map, because it's about productive relationships. And it's an attempt to provide a discussion about relationships and to give it some rigour. And clearly the text is central. Now, I never touch on Derrida with anything but extreme caution, but there's something that he makes clear, and Niall Lucy makes even clearer in his Derrida dictionary. The first point is that a text is constructed, and that's fine. We're familiar with that idea. But the second point is interesting. It's set in opposition to what it's not. The second quote implies that there are other things in the world, justice, truth, etc., which haven't been made, but which just are. According to this, as it goes on to say, the world belongs to being either text, representation, or presence. What's being challenged here is not the text, but the presence, the reality, as just existing, as unconstructed, as obvious, as unproblematic. And of course, there are enormous philosophical dimensions here, but modestly, it frees us to consider a text as inseparable from the world that it seems to come from, the world seemingly outside it. And Lucy finishes with a quote that cements the point. By not concerning himself with literature or text explicitly, Boomer left the field open, and this might have been a wise move. Following Derrida, the text ceases to be an object brought into the language workshop. It is the language workshop. The simple idea that we're moving from novel to film and just able to re-describe some of those points as director instead of writer and spectator instead of reader. This simple idea, it works well enough, but there's a problem here. The problem is that the director is not the creative unity in the same sense as the writer. The director is more of a marker for collaboration. And once we consider the contribution of others as essential to this whole process, we start to see a need for layering, vertical dimensions to Boomer's triangles. I'm not suggesting that every film needs to be approached in terms of these. Sometimes costume design is just costume design. But when Edith Head is designing for Alfred Hitchcock, it's worth a look at what she considers costume as text to be. When Walter Murch is directing for Francis Ford Coppola, he's shaping the text in a particular way, and it's an absolute creative collaboration. It opens the film up to choices, and lots of choices. They might make us dizzy as spectators. And I should say I'm initially using the term spectator as a preferred term for viewer, though for us it resonates with James Britton's spectator role of literature. That encapsulates the idea that literature allows readers to look back on experiences they have not had. My spectator is delirious because the film gives immediacy to this. Whereas the novel might seem like the recounting of a dream, film puts us in the dream, and it's the dream of another, with a string of images from which we somehow fashion some sense of what's going on, the sense of a whole. But back to the triangles, finally each node, the writer, the reader, the text itself, is both completed and undefinable. They're wholes, historically, socially, biographically determined, but always open to change. And I'll be using this term whole often as we go on. And I'm using it from Gilles Deleuze. For him, an image in a film is not a fragment. It's not part of a bigger picture. It is the whole. And this is in loose agreement with Derrida's Derrida's understanding of text. There are closed holes, there are open holes, there are sets. We could consider these, but you get the idea. Because it's important to understand in relation to cinema that these holes are in movement. And so Deleuze saw a film not as a series of shots and photographs, but a series of movements. Characters don't move through a space, the space moves. And more of this later, except to say now that each image, shot, character conveys a sense of a whole. And the point here that the point of this movement is a transformation of relationships. It's not out to establish a superior whole or even see parts of the movement building somewhere. It's the transformation of relationships between the bodies is his key point. So let's see how this works. In this clip from Tony Scott's Spy Game, Brad Pitt's character Nathan has just attempted to move an agent from East Berlin. The agent was killed and Pitt feels responsible. Redford, the senior spy, is his mentor. There's a language warning here, but I'm not sure what you're going to do with it. Maybe just put your hands over your ears.
Nathan, what happened? What went wrong?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Actually, one thing. Don't ever question me again. Ever.
What?
I give you an order, you take it. You don't ask why. Those 10 seconds on the phone could have blown the op.
The op was bringing Schmidt across.
The op was setting up Ann Cathcart, and your end had to look legit.
What are you telling me? Schmidt was bait?
Yes?
Nathan, they executed him on a shitty cellar floor.
And it could have been you. Let me tell you something about Schmidt. He went to the Russians a week ago and said he had a contact, an American, somebody he could use.
Don't tell me that. Don't fucking tell me that. You didn't look in his eyes. Don't tell me that.
He was your asset, somebody you used for information.
Oh, Jesus Christ. You don't just trade these people like they're baseball cards. It's not a fucking game.
Oh, yes, it is. It's exactly what it is. And it's no kid's game either. This is a whole other game. And it's serious and it's dangerous. And it's not one you want to lose.
Nathan, we killed this man. We used him and we killed him. Okay, then you gotta help me understand this one. Nathan, what are we doing here? And don't give me some bullshit about the greater good.
That's exactly what it's about. Because what we do is unfortunately very, very necessary. And if you're not willing to sacrifice scum like Schmidt for those that want nothing more than their freedom, then you better take a long, hard look at your chosen profession, my friend, because it doesn't get any easier. You want to walk? You want to walk? Walk.
should have told me about the op. You used me.
I did, and listen to this, because this is important. If you had pulled some stunt over there, if you had gotten nabbed, I wouldn't come after you. You go off the reservation, I will not come after you.
Fuck your rules, Nathan.
Okay. But tonight they saved your life.
Tony Scott loves his digital toys. He's using them to great effect here. I do worry about that chair being thrown over the edge. It might have hurt someone. And how ironic would it have been to have an innocent person killed by a chair thrown by someone debating the morality of killing an innocent person. And I wonder why Robert Redford's having his morning coffee in that particular position. But still, the point of this is that there are two wholes here, two universes brought into proximity, resulting in a transformation of relations, or about to result in a transformation of relations between the seasoned spy and the rookie. There's a negotiation taking place between fundamentally different forces. Everything about the structure of the shots reinforces this, the close-ups, the dizzying sweeps. And we'll consider editing a little bit later, but the purpose of editing is either to build up and define these wholes, or at least to put them into opposition, into juxtaposition, in order to effect some transformation. What we can't see in this clip is the complex development of mentorship and trust between the two. For Pitt's character and for Redford's, in a different way, all this is on the line. The dramatic setting supports a sense of vertigo and the precariousness of Pitt's character. In contrast, Redford's character is seated, secure, looks like he's just come from somewhere else. And the camera is part of the conversation. The editing positions us, the spectator, since we're not in or of either world. So where are we? We're in between the two, we're out in space looking at this from a much larger context. And finally, as the camera pulls back, we can read the wide shot of the city as Nathan's deliberation having consequences for others. Heroically, he stands on the edge of an abyss. And at the same time, it pulls back even further and we see it as a small conversation, one of many in the city. I want to compare this with a clip from Skyfall.
Perfect.
Would you mind if I asked you a business question?
Depends on the question.
It has to do with death.
A subject in which you're well versed.
How would you know that?
Only a certain kind of woman wears a backless dress with a Beretta 70 strapped to her thigh.
One can never be too careful when handsome men in tuxedos carry walkthroughs. I am correct in assuming you killed Patrice.
Yes.
But might I ask why?
I want to meet your employer.
Be careful what you wish for.
Okay, so what's different in this one? We can use Deleuze to observe that what we're watching here is a whole that contains the characters. There's a whole different feel to this. The characters have pasts and there's a negotiation here. It is high stakes and it's still about killing, but it's dialogue. And we're like a privileged audience member. We're watching something on the stage. We're close up. Even that beautiful framing of the bar is very much like a picture. We see relationships between characters in a physical space, and James Bond movies are so good with physical spaces. By comparison, the space in the previous clip has a psychological element to it. In this one, we rightly see the whole thing as part of a setting. In the first, a negotiation was taking place. In the second, we're watching a tense conversation between characters that never move much beyond necessary cliche, and this is somewhat rescued by a strong sense of irony. Still, in Skyfall, the characters are not being defined by their conversations. They're already defined, more or less. They're just adjusting these definitions in terms of each other, but not in terms of their own psychologies. This is not transformational. I could get cheesy here and suggest that the first clip, Spy Game, My World, Your World, Tense Negotiation, is in some way a Boomer metaphor for conversations in the classroom with its risk and uncertainty. And the scripted conversation is how what happens in the classroom is often presented, or sometimes even aspired to. Scripted, clearly defined relationships. I could get cheesy, but I won't. I'm more interested in how these two movies show us things about editing and putting spaces in opposition, worlds created, worlds in collision, worlds in negotiation, and how we might approach this in ways that open them to fresh understandings of the worlds we weave. This quote puts it nicely. The characters have attitudes, beliefs and dispositions which both reflect the culture from which they come and which enter into the conversation. I like the idea that characters bring with them their culture. Sometimes we see culture as a backdrop where all kind of performances are happening in front of this backdrop called culture. This way, it's a much more personal thing. The characters bring the culture with them. And I like the idea of cultures entering into conversation. So the character becomes a marker for his or her culture. What results is a space that's changed each of them in the process of being constructed. This is important in the Spy Game, and it might be a defining character of literature, that engagement is not neutral, and the act of engagement changes things. And so discussions are set up on all kinds of levels. I think we can be sensitive to this as a fundamental part of film analysis. Then we can start to see film as negotiation. Negotiations as embodied in the characters who cannot help but drag with them their whole world. Instead, we seem more likely to want to see film as image. So when we come to talk about editing, we're locked into a discussion about how images are juxtaposed instead of how wholes are created, and that's a much richer question. Even when they don't negotiate, they're still negotiating, looking for moments, fissures in the facade of common sense, for uncommon sense intervention, opportunities for acknowledging the world and orientation of characters. I love it. Fissures in the facade of common sense. You could be thinking that this is something Garth Boomer might have said. And well, in fact, you'd be right. It's time to come clean. These are not quotes about the film, but from Boomer's book, Negotiating the Curriculum. For Boomer, it's negotiating fissures in the facade of common sense teaching, and his idea that this is what we should be aware of. We're looking for the break, for the fissure. I was so taken with this, I was tempted to call this speech Garth Boomer, Loaves and Fissures, but I didn't. And also that final comment here, ways of connecting your abstractions with the lived reality of those compelled to be in your class. I think it's a really profound statement, and only teachers can understand the full implications of that comment. So it turns out I have been cheesy after all, as well as duplicitous. The other quotes aren't about the film, but come from Cynthia Honor and Bob Lebetsky. All members of the classroom have attitudes, beliefs. So the idea that children are bringing in their whole culture, and the sense that we don't homogenise this, that we recognise them with their own culture. And the Bob Lebetsky quote is as it stands. So Boomer brings into play here an awareness of fissures, of breaks, of small inconsistencies as the important thing, or as an important thing. They suggest creative potential for the teacher who's alert to them, and things not to be ignored. Chaos theory in mathematics began by paying attention to its own fissures, what was dismissed as margins of error in measurement and experiments interested them, and the whole chaos theory developed from that. In cinema, they might be small breaches in realism, or the conventions of realism. In the Spy Game, for example, that sweeping arc, beautiful shot, but it was interrupted halfway through. The sweeping arc wasn't continued. That's a fissure. There's a break there. These are the sorts of fissures that Deleuze discussed in terms of the construction of time in film and resulted in his radical time image. For him, the fissure was a shot held a little bit too long, Godard's jump cuts, or reflected images within images, especially in mirrors. These interrupt the realism of the movie, and their effect is to make us aware of the constructedness of the form. And so we're aware of the constructedness of the character, the motivation, the context, and ultimately of time. Fissures suggest a way into a transformative space. So my covert use of quotes is to see spaces in the film alongside spaces in the classroom as potentially transformative. Issey Miyake has a fine sense of these spaces. And it's not just a matter of looking for the unusual, the quirky, but being ready to take advantage of them. I started to prepare this presentation soon after seeing a major exhibition of Miyake's in Tokyo, and I was under his spell. The words that we're about to hear in Japanese are fold, connect, open, twist, layer, and then continue, keep going. And he's talking about concepts here as much as material. So let's have a bit of a look at this. Is from the exhibition. Hypnotic, and this was a massive structure in the presentation itself. I love his description of dress design as a space between a fabric and a body. And this might seem like a lightweight aesthetic approach, but in his hands it's profoundly historical and profoundly critical and deeply contextualised. His fabric is often regional, usually it's regional, made by artisans with traditional techniques. He will have spoken to them, worked with them, understood the particulars of the paper forms and the weaving. He will have worked with the manufacturers of his pleating machines. And then the bodies. The bodies are specific bodies, women of different ages and ethnicities, sportsmen and women, individuals at particular times and places. Steve Jobs' black turtleneck is from Miyake. This isn't a dialectic between fabric and body heading towards some kind of resolution. It's not an argument, it's a space. It's a conversation. And like any decent conversation, it's a space where creativity is valued, a space where things can be discovered, a workshop, a language workshop. But, and this is the key point, it's framed by an understanding of what's essential to the medium. Here we might seem to be departing from Boomer, but I'm suggesting this drive towards essences is not far from Boomer's what Boomer termed as an ideal set of generalisations. These should be the business of curriculum statements. It's not idealism, in fact, it's close to the opposite. It's a distillation of the experience of teachers working in the classroom. Stella, MySpace are about developing such sets of generalisations. They're only ideal in that they need to become recontextualised to be applicable, but they're rooted in the real experiences of teachers in the classrooms. How do we keep all this open and complex enough to allow ourselves and our students to engage without falling back into our cliches? This is a direct question I'm asking of film, and I want to proceed in terms of 3 productive relationships. I also want to proceed in terms of fissures, this idea of opening up spaces. And I like the idea of a space developing from a fissure, from a hardly noticeable tear that once you tease and annoy it becomes a rip that you just can't help but notice. It's like disregarding your mother's advice. Leave it alone, you'll only make it worse. Well, yes, Mum, let's make it worse. And I can give you a fine example here. I love this. This is Roland Barthes' discussion of Julius Caesar, the 1953 movie. The fissure for him was this. It's that hairstyle, that fringe that combed down, that only worked for Brando. Barthes suggests it worked for Brando because to a European eye, Brando is conceivably Roman. He has a body of work that gives him credibility and strength. The rest are playing at being Roman and thinking that they can be convincing if there's fringes combed in a certain way. This is a great model for film analysis because it's paying attention. There's a sense of humour and irreverence, but it moves very quickly into important questions about sign and culture. Again, as with Miyake, it's the understanding of the material that creates the potentials. And what seems once obvious and profound comes out of this essential understanding. So what's essential in terms of film? I want to move in terms of three spaces between visual and sound, images through editing, and between characters through the script. And it links very nicely. If we're talking about visuals and sound, we're talking about sensory awareness of our world, and this is where the wonder comes from. So the weaving worlds with wonder works quite nicely here. Our teaching of film is heavily weighted towards the visual. And I want to give you an example of 3 resource books to show how there is an imbalance between the visual and the sound. But I also want to say that I'm not critical of these textbooks. I recommend them, I use them, and what's more, I'm in no position to criticise. My workshops have been entirely based on visuals, and I ran a newsletter called Viz, Visual Text. Instead, I want to suggest that these are the dominant picture of practice in cinema. Susan Hayward, Cinema Concepts, 45 references to visuals, 5 to sound. Brian Moons, and Brian's doing quite different things. This isn't just a list of terms. 66 visual, 12 sound, and 64 other. And when you consider the other as production, genre, roles, etc., it breaks down to 64, so you can see how strong the visuals are. And Thomas Caldwell's wonderful book, the Film Analysis Handbook, 106 in his glossary, 106 references to the visual, 12 to sound, and other 44. And then 2 quotes from his: sound is used to give meaning to the visuals, and sound is used to highlight aspects of the visuals that the filmmaker wants the audience to focus on. Both those quotes sum up the attitude generally in film studies, and not just in teaching. I think generally in film criticism, there's this idea that sound is there to support the visuals. Rick Altman recognised this in the 80s and set out to redress this. In 2 of his books, the French Studies, the Yale French Studies, number 60, but more importantly, his Sound Theory and Practice are great starting points if you are interested in sound and you want to get decent background. His argument was to try to make the sound stand alongside the visual as a sign. And he went back to Peirce in much the same way Christian Metz did with visuals, went back to Peirce and came up with the indexical, the iconic and symbolic. If we think about a siren, the indexical is when we see the siren with the ambulance. The iconic is when maybe there's a street scene, a nighttime cityscape, and we hear the ambulance. We don't see it, but we understand what it is. The symbolic, we're quite used to symbolism, but William Costanzo, in Reading Movies, says that the sirens that begin and end Rebel Without a Cause are part of a storyline. The police are on the way. It's also part of the film's symbolic structure, a metaphor for an anguished cry for help. So as the sirens pick up, this is what happens often in literature. Something's introduced in an indexical way, in a realistic way, and it's repeated. The idea of a motif repeating and gathering symbolism as it goes along. The other way of approaching sound is David Byrne's idea that sound isn't identifiable as an image. This is the other spectrum, other end of the spectrum. This is acoustic culture. In acoustic culture, the world, like sound, is all around you. This is important because sound often links to the rest of the world. Often we have an image on the screen, and we get a sense of the rest of the world through the sound. But his point here is that sound comes at you from all directions. In a visual culture, image is in a fixed spot in front of you. It isn't everywhere at once. And this final point, in an acoustic universe, one senses essences. In a visual universe, one senses categories and hierarchies. we'll just have a look at that. I want this idea that sound and visions are doing something different. We'll just have a look at the start of Apocalypse Now, because this is a great example of sound and vision working collaborative, working in a partnership to create something that is quite different from what either of them produce in isolation.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend. The end of our elaborate plans. The end of everything that stands. The end, no safety or surprise. The end, I'll never look into your eyes again. Can you picture what will be? So limitless and free, lost in a romance, wilderness of pain, and all the children are insane.
It hurt me to have to cut that. I just love watching it. Usually if I see that, I'm in for the rest of the movie. So Deleuze, this is a good indication of what Deleuze describes as the visual and the sonic images. And this isn't actually Deleuze, it's Ronald Bogue talking about him. Deleuze's work is very dense and it's a philosophical work, so it needs some interpretation or application, and Ronald Bogue is a good person to do this. So this idea that two films are being established here, and it gives the idea of a double cinema, but then the point that Deleuze stresses that modern films are not really double. That the problem of modern cinema is to maintain the autonomy of sight and sound, but the reason for that is to produce new relationships through their conjunction. This is a really nice way of putting it. And you can see in that clip the way the music provides continuity. Once the music is there, this is often a role of song and music, it provides the continuity, then the other sounds and the visuals are free to do other things. And the slow motion, sure, these are the sounds of helicopters, so it should be indexical, it should be a realistic interpretation, but it's slowed down and the timing's out a little bit, and then the sound of the helicopters merges into the sound of the fan in the end. So we're slipping between these categories, so the symbolic, the indexical, iconic, and this is as it should be. So the point of coming up with these terms is not to show how clever we are in identifying these things, but to give us the vocabulary to be able to talk about a complex piece like that. Once you start to say, oh, okay, that's indexic, and then it moves, and you say, you're aware of certain things happening here. And Walter Murch he's extraordinary for his sound. He won the Academy Award for this, but he's also really important in editing. And this is the fissure between the visual, sorry, no it's not. This is the space between the images through editing. And this is the weaving of worlds. I mean, this is quite literally the weaving of worlds. So it works very nicely with the conference theme. Luckily, Walter Murch loves to talk about his work, so I direct you to YouTube. There's lots of his lectures and discussions on YouTube. Editing is fundamental, but like sound, it doesn't get the attention it should. And there are reasons for this. Editing's hard to put your finger on. They just seem to be ways of connecting shots. But what's essential is that they weave the world of the character and they position the viewer. Editing is the production of relationships. So when Deleuze took film to its roots, it was not the frame, it wasn't the shot that was essential, but the movement. And he defined cinema as an art based on movement. What made it different from, say, dance is that movement was edited. It was edited movement. So this is for Deleuze the understanding of what film is. It's edited movement. Objects do not just move through space, as common sense would have us, but whole spaces move. We can clearly see this in Alfred Hitchcock because there's a formal setting to his spaces. We'll have a look at this clip to see how spaces are set up and defined through the juxtaposition of shots.
Mrs. Grundy said something about Santa Cruz, about seagulls getting lost in a fog and flying in towards the lights.
We don't have any fog. There's not any.
Make our own fog.
How do you figure to do that?
We can use smoke puffs the way the Army uses them.
Look! They're attacking again. Well, Melanie, you stay in here. Come on out.
Take it back.
Look at the gas. That man's lighting a cigar.
Hey, you! Don't drop that match! Look out! Get out of there!
Mr. Run!
Watch out!
Mr.
Look out! Look out! Watch out!
So there's Tippi Hedren's character in the safe space of the diner, and the outside world is dangerous. And you know, there's the window opening as a barrier between them. I love the reactions of Tippi Hedren's character. This is pure Russian montage. The idea that you show the reaction and you show the shot. But there's that other space with the birds, and it's an indication that you don't need to edit. Sometimes spaces can be redefined by the action that happens in them. So we've got the wide shot and we think, oh yeah, this is a wide perspective of what's going on there. But when the birds enter, it changes. They bring with it a sense of menace, and that space changes how we read the other spaces. So it's the way the spaces are working in relation to each other that's really important. With Alfred Hitchcock, it is really formal. There are other, Paolo Sorrentino is a director I'm enjoying a great deal, and in his latest film, Youth, he uses editing and the worlds, a sense of editing worlds, in quite a different way, and it shows the uncertainty of the characters, and often a thought is developed but then not continued any further. So he's still using editing techniques to do this, but there's a whole different purpose. With Alfred Hitchcock, it's much more formal, I think. And so to weaving spaces between characters through the scripts. This is weaving worlds with words. See how good I've been with the title? If we only think of words as a blueprint, then we can safely ignore it in analysis, and we usually do. While the script doesn't define the wholes, it may indicate how to think about them. The world is often built around the character, and characters are depicted in terms of what they draw attention to. It's this drawing of attention that's the role of dialogue in the script. And this is through words, just as an indication of the way words work. If we saw this, a woman looks out the window, it makes entire sense to us, but the statement cannot be made visually. There's no such thing as a woman visually. It has to be a specific woman, and language can never get that sense of specificity that the image has. Even if we try to be comprehensive, a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair, wearing a blue dress, it sounds like a police report. And all we're doing is drawing attention to various aspects of the character which don't amount to her presence. So we can see that a woman sits at the window. Immediately, we've got context, we've got character, we've got things happening. So it's a mistake, I think, to consign dialogue to sound as it usually is. Its other function, because it relies on words, is to draw attention and the nature of attention. So the script lends wonderfully to analysis and to reading if we look at it in terms of spaces between characters. And that the opening graphic of Carol. Carol's a wonderful movie just in terms of those relationships. We can then have a rich discussion about what's going on and valued in their worlds, forgetting the visuals before we actually get to the viewing of it. So we're not looking at the script as a blueprint. There's something else going on here. I'm suggesting a partnership here, not one essence, but three essences. I've got animation there as well. I think animation is essential to movies, even in terms of the movie is technically an animation, but also the idea of Disney. Disney was doing amazing things. He thought he was doing them with movies. He was using the movie form, but we tend to dismiss him a little bit, but he was doing amazing things with film. And green screen movies like Sin City, through to CGI. I'm often surprised to see a CGI credit at the end of a movie. Because where was the CGI in that? But it's an essential part of filmmaking these days. And the list could go on. But I like to see these essentials as forces working. I like to see them as tectonic plates, as you know, sometimes a tectonic plate will result, a movement will result in a volcano, other times a tsunami, other times an earthquake. And just by the way, look, Australia is very nicely placed on this tectonic plate. If you go up here, where 4 tectonic plates meet, that's where I live. How do we juggle all this? How do we keep in mind all these different elements and the way the forces are working? Our aim these days, I think, is not to stimulate students, but to focus them. I think they get enough stimulation. To remind students of the joy of delving deeper into film, and to do that without killing the experience for them by telling them what to look for. So we need to negotiate the text with them. How do we do this in ways that keep the student voice open? The first thing to do is to keep them in the conversation. I'd just like to share with you a bit of my own practice that when we're doing a formal study of Run Lola Run in grade 9, we begin with a brainstorm of terms that I organise according to the whiteboard. And these include literary terms, down the bottom here, somewhere, like characters, plots and themes, but I don't want to suggest to them that this is the only way of approaching film. I assign the groups, put them into groups and assign them the task of taking this brainstorm and putting them onto posters. The first 2 are pretty straightforward, the visual and the sound. The second 2 get a bit tricky, one in terms of editing and the other in terms of story. I often change the title of the final one, but the idea is a story being told in a cinematic way. And I like this middle one was pretty functional, but they were insisting on putting romance in there. So the story in a movie involved an element, and I think it's quite a perceptive comment. This one got much more complex. I did allow them some research, but the research wasn't the point. What the point was to get them talking, to give them some terms to think about. Run Lola Run's great because it's in 3 sections. So the first section we view in terms of their poster. So a group will watch it in terms of their assigned poster. But then we swap posters for the second one, so they're working with a poster that they didn't compile. And feedback's really important. Sometimes we'll stop and get a group to feedback on what's happening in terms of visuals or sound or whatever. But the final summative task is almost never in the form of a written essay. I'm very taken recently, I haven't worked with them enough, but I'm very taken recently with the idea of audio-visual and video essays as something we might use in the classroom. They use the essentials of film, sound, visuals and editing, and they're able to make some subtle comments. Adrian Martin and Christina Alvarez use this form. They take it to great heights in their work. It's their preferred form of critical discussion. And I've identified 2 modes. One of video, which provides a commentary by juxtaposing. Jonathan Scobie did this really well in his presentation, juxtaposing 2 films and running them side by side and making connections. That's one form. The other that we might be interested in is the voice-over audio-visual essay. And I'd just like to have a look at Adrian Martin's. Have a look at this as personal engagement, critical understanding, referencing and citation of text, and an economical movement from watching a movie as a kid to considering Goddard and other theory.
When I was 14 years old, I drew up a list of films I needed to see as a budding cinephile, and then I scoured the columns of the Australian TV Guide each week, waiting for them to appear. So, one night, I set an alarm for 3 a.m, tiptoed to the lounge room and watched Nicholas Ray's They Live by Night on my parents' small black and white television, with the volume turned down very low. About 100 minutes later, happy and satisfied, I went back to bed. But when I awoke again to go to school the next day, I had forgotten absolutely every detail of the film. It had vanished like a dream in the night. All I knew was that I had liked it and that it had left a strong melancholic feeling in me. I saw They Live by Night perhaps 3 or 4 further times over the next 35 years. Yet each time, as if cursed by that initial nocturnal viewing, I had real trouble holding the details of the film in my memory. It has proven hard, even impossible for me to recall. It turned into a permanent blur. Intriguingly, I am not the only cinephile to experience weird disturbances of memory in relation to They Live by Night. French philosopher Jacques Rancière recounts how he rewatched the film in order to relive a particular overwhelming moment in it. But, as he discovered, I couldn't find this shot because it doesn't exist. What Rancière went back to re-find was a powerful introductory image he had remembered of a singular woman, the character of Kichi, played by Cathy O'Donnell. What he then discovered was really this: a figure of indeterminate gender, her facial features obscured, revealed little by little in the course of the first encounter between her and Bowie, played by Farley Granger. How different this is to Robert Altman's casual introduction of the same character 27 years later in his adaptation of the same novel, Edward Anderson's Thieves Like Us, where Kichi is simply real, unglamorous, just another piece of the overall mise-en-scène.
There's more to it, but I'm aware of the time. I think this is a wonderful form for opening up all kinds of things and working with the medium of television, of film, in order to come to understandings of it, to share those understandings. You can find lots of video and audio-visual essays on Catherine Grant's wonderful, indispensable blog, Film Studies for Free, and she's created many herself. This is a form that she likes. So a world woven with words creates a reader, a world woven with images and wonder. I think that's another thing. I've made the separation for my own purposes. My Delirious Spectator in the title suggests a viewer, a spectator, who's open to the wonder of the world, open to the flow of information, oral, visual, digital, literary, as well as visual in an unmediated way. But it's not that the delirious spectator is adrift in a flood of information. Delirium has its own narrative. A dream seems to be random, and it is, but in retrospect, it's recountable. It's not just it's simply not the narrative we might expect, but it's specific. The path it takes, the importance it gives one thing over another, is sometimes bizarre and frightening, unhinged and creative. Deleuze joined Felix Guattari in creating a concept that takes this into account. It's the concept of schizoanalysis, in which delirium is a free and uninhibited experience of images and phenomena. It's an attempt to theorise delirium as a way of understanding creativity. To them, it's in opposition to authoritarian forces that present themselves as beyond criticism, as natural. Their use of schizophrenia as a model and analogy is provocative and intensely and intentionally political. Ian Buchanan takes this directly into film by asking the question, is schizoanalysis of film possible? And there are all kinds of links. And Ian Buchanan's a wonderful Deleuze scholar, so he's bringing Deleuze's earlier work into his understanding of film. But schizoanalysis finally, and delirium finally suggest uncertainty and the celebration of uncertainty and restlessness. In Deleuze, as in Boomer, what's prominent and attractive is an intellectual restlessness. It drives them to consider essential understandings, conceptual spaces, holes, relationships between them, and to create them from gaps and breaks, fissures. One of the terms I like from the Miyake slide is finally to continue, to keep going. This doesn't end. You don't get to a point where you understand everything about a movie. And Boomer has things to say about this, because in order to make this possible, it needs a physical space. So let's give Garth Boomer the last word here. How do we accommodate this? Well, first of all, Boomer says that the school should be a language-rich workshop. And notice he's not saying the English classroom. The school should be a language-rich workshop, where children are actively engaged in talking about how it works. I'm reminded of Barbara Comer's wonderful examples in her opening plenary. And in evaluating the quality of what they have done so that they can do it better next time. Now, doing it better next time is not the goal. To do analysis so students can get better at doing analysis, this is a move towards standardised testing. The ongoing appeal of Boomer is he helped to build, in collaboration with many others, a model of approaching the classroom that will always be in opposition to exams, standardised testing, prescriptive curriculum frameworks, accountability based on externals. As these are promoted, the other side will always be Boomer's sense of negotiation, which includes debts to Vygotsky, Britain, and the voices of some teachers here in this audience. Guattari defines schizoanalysis as the activation of another world of possibilities. I think it's a great test to put on a movie. Does it activate another world of possibilities? It's also a great test for our classrooms. There are many in front of me who knew Garth Boomer and have clear memories of him. For others, for younger teachers, you, through the Garth Boomer address are maybe constructing some virtual memories of him. But I invite you to go back to negotiating the curriculum and to see it as a living document, not as a bit of archaeology. You look at the collections of voices and wonder why we define it as Boomer, but then you see the gravitational force. And let me underscore the title of this book, Educating for the 20th Century. Well, here we are. And it begs the question of how we're doing, and this is where the conference started with the question of Dartmouth and what was happening with Dartmouth. To others, educating for the 20th century meant engaging with technologies and innovation, educating the students for jobs that have not yet been invented. But for Boomer and his collaborators, it was about productive relationships of passion, politics and pedagogy. And I think they got it right. I can't think of a more important conversation to be having or remembering at this time. If you'd like any of my references, I've got an annotated bibliography of sorts, and if you email me, I can send them to you. That's probably the best way of doing it. And if there's something you were looking for that isn't there, then let's start a chat. But there's my email address if you want it. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm sure you'll agree with me that he's done a wonderful job at weaving various threads, the Garth Boomer's heritage, the fascinating, and I've got to say, impressive research he's done into some serious film buffs, and then translating it into words that we can actually understand. And then all of that into stuff where we need to go in our own classrooms and think about what we're doing. So he's been a great choice for us for the Garth Boomer address, and I'd like you to thank him one more time.
Thank you.